In the 16th century, the Japanese wrote of barbarians from the south landing on their shores. Today, we call those barbarians the Portuguese. And they brought lots of stuff with them, including dessert, like this kiran somen, or chicken egg noodles. So thank you to Vite Ramen for sponsoring this video as we see how these barbarians changed Japanese cuisine forever. This time on Tasting History. So the Japanese word used to describe these first visiting Europeans was namban, which meant southern barbarians. Originally, it came from Chinese and referred to raiders from the south, and since in 1543 the Portuguese would have come from that direction, calling them that just made sense. Eventually, namban lost its negative connotation and came to refer to anything from that period that was exotic, i.e. influenced by foreigners, especially Europeans. Like this recipe for kiran somen. It comes from a collection of recipes compiled likely in the early 17th century called namban ryorisho, which Eric Rath translated as the Southern Barbarians Cookbook. Strain egg yolks with a cloth. Heat sugar until it becomes a syrup and dribble the egg yolks over it like fine kudzu noodles. Stretch these out and sprinkle with sugar. There are oral instructions. What those instructions are, I do not know, and I'm sure they're absolutely necessary to the making of this dish. Luckily, we have a lot of modern versions that we can take hints from because these are still made with slight variations in Japan, Thailand, India, Malaysia, Brazil, and they're still actually made in Portugal today under the name fios de ovos, or egg threads. But in Japan, there is actually a shop in Fukuoka Prefecture, and they've been making them since 1673, and they claim that they make them the same way now as they did then, so we can take some hints from how they do it. Now this recipe only has 2 ingredients, egg yolk and sugar, 3 if you count the water. And so I assumed that it was so simple, so it would be so easy. I was a fool, because it is not easy. Actually, making these noodles is rather difficult, unlike the very easy to make noodles from today's sponsor, Vite Ramen. So here's the thing, every time I talk about Vite Ramen here on the channel, I get people saying it's pronounced vite, and I have to admit, I actually thought it was pronounced vite when I first started with them, but the CEO and founder, Tim, assures me that it is pronounced Vite, like bite. And I get to chat with the CEO because instead of a big faceless conglomerate, they are a small business based here in the United States. They actually make the noodles here themselves, and so they're able to make sure that only the finest ingredients are making it in. Their ramen is high in protein, high in fiber, and filled with nutrients, and they actually listen to customer feedback so they are able to change and update the recipe, making it better each time. It's a quick meal, but a healthy one too. So to give Vite Ramen a try, click the link in the description to get a bundle that includes free gifts and free shipping in the contiguous United States. And don't forget to use my code TASTINGHISTORY10 to get an additional 10% off at checkout. That's viteramen.com/tastinghistory, or just click the link in the description and use my code TASTINGHISTORY10. And after a quick and easy noodle from Vite Ramen, you can get started on the more laborious and rather difficult noodle that we are making today. But I promise you, it's so worth it. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 20 egg yolks, and you're going to want to use free-range chickens if you can, simply because the egg yolks tend to be darker and a little bit more orange, and so it ends up looking better as a final product. Today, often actually they add a little bit of orange food coloring when they make them, so you can also do that. 4.5 cups or 900 grams of sugar, and 6 cups or 1.5 liters of water. So I actually first tried making this without the water because it's not mentioned in the recipe. And it turns out it doesn't work because you have to get the sugar so hot to cook the eggs that it ends up turning to caramel if you don't add some water. So I'm assuming that one of the oral instructions that aren't actually included water. So add the sugar to the water before setting it over medium heat. And you want to dissolve the sugar by stirring with a wooden spoon as it heats. But as soon as it is dissolved, stop touching it, because the more you mess with it, the more likely you're going to create sugar crystals, and that can ruin the whole thing. Also, you can do this in a pot, it works just fine, but if you use a wok, it's a lot easier because it's just easier to maneuver the noodles once you put them in there. So if you have a wok, that's the thing to use. As the syrup heats, stir your eggs up to get them smooth, but don't beat them because you don't want to add extra air to the eggs. Now the recipe says to strain these through a cloth, and you will, but first I suggest straining them through a strainer to get any big pieces, and then put it into the cloth after that. I'm using a bag that's meant for nut milk, but if you don't have one of those, then just a piece of cheesecloth will do just fine. Also, you can make a smaller amount of this. You don't need 20 egg yolks, you can do this with 8 or 10, but this first time you do it, I suggest doing all 20 because it takes a little practice to get the method down, and I'd hate for you to run out of egg yolks before you actually figure out how to do it. Now when it comes to actually making the noodles, there are a few options. You can get a funnel that is actually meant for making this. They're very popular in Thailand, and the funnel has little holes that are in the bottom. But if you don't have one of those, you can put it into a bottle and then poke little holes in the lid, or you can use a piping bag, but you want the hole very small, basically just big enough for the egg yolk to run out in a constant thread. Then once the sugar syrup is boiling, put the funnel or bag of egg yolk over the pan and let it run out in a single thread, forming circles in the syrup. And you want to keep it moving fairly fast because you don't want any breaks in the line, and you want about 20 to 25 circles. Then stop the yolk and let it cook for about 15 seconds. That's really all that it takes. Then take a chopstick and gently pull one side of the circle to meet the other. Drag the noodles through the syrup a few times, making sure that they're coated, and then pull them up using a second chopstick to stabilize and wrap them so that you can let the syrup drain before setting them on a wire rack to dry for 30 minutes. Like I said, the process takes a little time to figure out how to do it right. Honestly, I never quite got it exactly how I wanted it, but I got close enough, and I definitely got better by the end. So be patient, relax, and listen while I tell you how this dish got from Portugal to Japan. On September 23, 1543, on the southern tip of the island Tanegashima, a big ship arrived at dawn at Nishinomura Bay. No one knew from what country it came. There were some 100 people on board, some whose physical features differed from ours, and whose language was not understood. Those who saw them found them strange. With the strangers was a man named Goho, who was a Chinese scholar, but Goho could not speak Japanese, and the village chief who came down to meet the ship could not speak Chinese. But they could both read and write Chinese, so they communicated by taking sticks and writing Chinese in the sand. And Goho wrote, "They are traders from among the namban, southwestern barbarians. They have some knowledge of the relationship between superior and inferior, but otherwise they do not know about propriety. Therefore, when they drink, they do not use cups, and when they eat, they use their fingers, and not chopsticks as we do. They show their feelings without any self-control, and they do not know the written script or the use of it. Such traders are in the habit of roving from place to place, bartering things which they have for those they do not have. They are not very strange, and are quite harmless." These quite harmless people were the Portuguese, and they are the first known Europeans to arrive in Japan. And it's somewhat ironic that he calls them quite harmless, seeing as of all the items that they brought to trade, the Japanese author only mentions one. They had in their possession an object which was about 2 or 3 shaku in length. As for its shape, it was straight on the outside with a passage inside, and made of a heavy substance. Even though its inside was hollow, its bottom end was closed. There was an aperture at the side through which fire was applied. Its shape could not be compared with anything else. When used, some mysterious medicine powder was put into it, and a small lead pellet was added. When it was discharged, fire issued from the opening. The explosion seemed like lightning, and the sound like rolling thunder. All bystanders covered their ears. Of course, this was the matchlock firearm and was anything but harmless and changed warfare in Japan forever. But it wasn't just weaponry that they brought, because in the years following this first exchange, Portuguese ships were a common sight in the harbor off of Nagasaki. Along with weapons, the Portuguese brought galleon-style shipbuilding, tobacco, Venetian glass, Flemish clocks, and if the namban art style is any indication, the Portuguese also introduced hammer pants.
Stop! Hammer time!
But more relevant to this show, the Portuguese and later the Spanish brought new ingredients and recipes and new cooking methods to the Japanese. cayenne pepper and potatoes from the Americas, corn, pumpkin, and sweet potatoes, which at one point made up 60% of the diet of those who lived in regions with low rice production. The Portuguese also brought sugar, which was not new to Japan. They had had sugar before, but used it in their medicine. But the Portuguese were avid users of sugar in their cooking, and they dominated the sugar trade around the world. So they shared many recipes for nambangashi, or Southern Barbarian sweets, with the Japanese, a number of which actually appear in the cookbook that we're cooking from today. Perhaps the most well-known was a cake from Castile that the Portuguese called bolo de castela, which in Japanese became castera. Not only did the cake include sugar, but it also introduced the concept of using beaten eggs as a leavener. The problem was, to bake it, you needed an oven, and ovens were not common in Japanese kitchens at the time. So they changed the method to bake the cake in a pot that was set over a fire, and then the lid was put on with hot coals on top. And the cake is still popular in Japan today, though I do believe now they mostly use ovens. Now, there are a whole host of other sweets from Portugal that made their way to Japan that are still popular today. Sugar candies called confeito, coming from the Portuguese word confeito, biscoito from biscoitos, caramelo from caramelo, and a whole host of others, including savory dishes, like perhaps the most famous namban dish, tempura. And in the cookbook from the 17th century, there is an early recipe for something that might be this called tempurari, and it is a piece of chicken that has been seasoned with spices like clove and cinnamon and ginger, and then it's fried in oil and colored with gardenia fruit, which can produce a bright yellow dye. And not long after that, about 70 years or so later, there are recipes for tempura that actually start to look like what we eat today. And so I think I need to do a whole video on that. Now, two other foods that were introduced at this time were leavened bread and wine made from grapes. But these did not come with the European traders, but rather the European Christian missionaries, both bread and wine being used in the Eucharist or communion. In 1549, the Jesuit Francis Xavier arrived in Japan and set out to convert Japan to Catholicism. But it wasn't the bread and wine that the new Japanese converts craved. Rather, it was beef. See, many Japanese had long eschewed both beef and dairy products, partly due to the fact that cattle were more valuable as beasts of burden than as sources of food, but also because the religious authorities had banned the consumption of beef centuries earlier. In fact, they had put bans on eating many different meats, and if you did eat them, then you had to do penance at your local shrine for a prescribed number of days. And while a goat or rabbit got you 5 days, and venison or pork got you 60, the eating of beef gave you 150 days of penance. But while Buddhism and Shintoism did not allow the consumption of meat at the time, Catholicism had no such restriction, so the Japanese converts began to eat the beef that the missionaries were offering them. In the city of Oita, on the day after Easter in 1557, missionaries held a feast for 400 new Christian converts, and they bought a cow and they cooked it along with some rice in a style that seems very similar to paella. And in many cities that the missionaries were at, the price of beef skyrocketed. In 1652, the poet Matsunaga Teitoku wrote that around the time when Christianity was introduced to Japan, even people in the Kyoto region referred to beef as waka and ate it as a highly prized delicacy. Waka possibly coming from the Portuguese word vaca, meaning cow. But while some people embraced this new Christian cuisine, others did not. What foul things have foreign priests done to Japanese converts? They are the worst enemies of Japan. Their black ships carry goods, and they set up rare items for display. If someone comes to look for people who like to drink alcohol, they offer grape wine. And for teetotalers, they proffer things like castera, carumeru, and compeito to enlist followers to their sect. And in 1587, the missionaries were expelled from Japan. Then, in 1612, the Tokugawa shogunate outlawed Christianity of any kind. And with it, there was a decline in the consumption of beef and bread. And it wasn't just the European missionaries that the shogunate was getting tired of, but Europeans in general. In 1624, the Spanish were banned, and in 1639, the Portuguese. And for the next 200 years, the only European power that was allowed to trade in Japan were the Dutch, partly because they showed no interest in converting anyone to Christianity. But even then, they were isolated to trading on one tiny man-made island in Nagasaki Harbor, called Dejima, and they were not allowed to have any contact with ordinary citizens. So while the Dutch were there for over 200 years, their cuisine has virtually no effect on that of Japan. Portugal, on the other hand, who was only there for a few decades, well, they still to this day, their cuisine has an effect on the food that is in Japan. But basically, as soon as they left, maybe even sooner, the Japanese changed the foods to make them their own. Beef was replaced with fish, and wheat flour with glutinous rice flour, and milk and cream were pretty much removed altogether. And when it came to leavening bread, instead of using ale barm or sourdough, they used amazake, a low-alcohol drink of fermented rice. Though there are a few dishes that seem to have changed virtually not at all in the last few centuries, including somen, or chicken egg noodles. So as soon as you've gone through the last of the egg yolk and let the noodles dry for a half hour, they are ready, though how you plate them can be rather tricky. Different places in the world plate them in many, many different ways, but this recipe says to pull them out like long strings. But I'm sure that somebody can. I was unable. They just kept breaking. They're very, very fragile. So I'm doing as it's often done now in Japan and folding them over on themselves and then cutting off the end. And here we are, 17th century somen, chicken egg noodles. And it says to sprinkle them with sugar, so do that right before you serve them. They are so pretty. They're just like so vibrant. Yeah, I'm excited. Here we go. It's falling apart already. That's fantastic. So let's first talk about the texture, because that's what's so impressive. You can feel every individual noodle. They don't like, that's really, really interesting. They all stay very, very separated, and they're rather firm. You have to like bite through it. They don't just like melt. I kind of figured they would. There's just egg and sugar. So I would think that it would melt, but it doesn't. You do have to kind of chew it. Really cool texture. The flavor is fantastic too. What's interesting, pleasantly so, is it's not eggy at all. It does not taste like egg. It kind of reminds me of creme brulee, which is also made with egg and sugar and cream, but I wouldn't say tastes like egg. But there is a creaminess about it, but mostly it's just sweet. I can see why in some places they add, different flavorings, vanilla or jasmine, because that would kind of, change it, I guess. But honestly, it's really good this way. Really good. So make sure to check out Vite Ramen. Follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller. And if you have a bunch of egg whites left, watch the video on Fanny Farmer's Angel Food Cake. I'll make sure that that's down here somewhere that you can click on. And I will see you next time on Tasting History. Seriously, I'm gonna eat all of them. They feel low-cal. They're not, but they feel low-cal. So light.